Hello, everyone. In this podcast, we will be discussing sensitive topics such as sexual assault. It's important to take care of yourself while listening. Some suggestions are listening while you're in a healthy headspace or knowing who you can reach out to if you become upset. Our 24/7 helpline for crisis calls based out of Central Florida is 407-500-HEAL. By contacting the national hotline at 1-800-656-4673, you can get support and learn about your local resources. There's always someone ready to help. Welcome to the Victim Service Center podcast. Here we sit down with professionals that serve survivors and victims of trauma or those who've experienced violence and have conversations about social issues. Today, we are talking about healing and surviving. My name is Emilie Mitchell. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm the education coordinator at the Victim Service Center of Central Florida. Today, we have two amazing survivors here to chat about their healing journeys. First off, I have Karla Molina. Karla uses she, her pronouns and is a former client at the Victim Service Center. She successfully completed her treatment at the VSC after a 4+ year journey of healing. Karla looks to empower others to take charge of their future and empower them to grow into the best version of themselves by sharing her story and her successes with the VSC. So Karla, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And also, Kelly Beam joins us today from Orlando, Florida, where she lives with an enormous 17-pound cat and a tiny 5-pound Yorkie. Kelly uses she, her pronouns and has survived date rape by the police officer brother of her best friend in her 20s, repeated sexual abuse by her alcoholic ex-husband in her 30s and 40s, and being abducted, drugged, and assaulted by two strangers a few months after her 50th birthday. Kelly has received individual and group therapy for 4 years through the Orange County Victim Service Center, where she met and developed an ongoing supportive friendship with our other guest, Karla. So Kelly, thank you so much as well for being here today.
My pleasure.
I'm really excited and honored to be here and have this conversation with you both. As a very brief introduction, we have spoken a lot on this podcast about healing, how it is not linear, that it is individual and different for everyone, and is a journey for survivors of trauma. Today, we are joined by two amazing survivors who have agreed to share their stories on what specifically helped them to move towards healing and surviving. So in this episode, we will be touching on multiple victimizations, barriers survivors could face when coming forward, debunking some myths, the different ways survivors can heal, and how we can support people in our lives who have been affected by trauma. So with that, Kelly and Karla, can you both share a bit about how you got connected at the VSC?
This is Kelly speaking, and I got connected with the VSC when the kidnapping detective on my case called, and I had a pretty awful experience at the emergency room and with the police, a lot of making me feel more like the culprit instead of the victim, and a lot of not believing and not having services offered. I wasn't offered a rape kit, and I was told that I could not receive any kind of advocate services unless I agreed to press charges. And because I was drugged and couldn't remember in detail what had happened to me, I wasn't ready to do that. And after 5 hours of questioning, I left without being given any medical treatment. And it wasn't until almost 36 hours later when the detective called me, and I broke down sobbing and saying, can you please help me, at least get me a medical exam in case the people that assaulted me gave me STD And he gave me the hotline, the sexual assault hotline to call. And through that number, I was connected immediately with a nurse practitioner and a victim advocate that met me at a safe place within 15 to 30 minutes and took care of me. And that was my introduction.
And my situation was a little different. I had just graduated from college. I was going through some substance abuse problems pretty severely. My parents kind of had an intervention with me, kind of gave me the option that I needed to either pick rehab or therapy. And at that point, I decided to do therapy. And I had a friend who actually was my current boss at that time, who helped me look into different places and found this VSC online and gave me the number. And I remember like the first time that I made an appointment and I walked in and I wanted to turn out and leave, but I did a short stint at first. And then I came back when they moved over to the other Orlando location, started with Brandy. And that's how I ended up doing the rest of my treatment.
Thank you both for sharing your stories. And I'm really glad that you were able to find the VSE. I know that we talked a little bit about when we were meeting for this podcast about, how you and Kelly and Karla together kind of connected through groups at the VSE and also the multiple victimization. So I don't know if you wanted to touch on that a little bit.
So I'll share a little bit about that. My first sexual assault, I was a minor. It was somebody that I knew, and I just, trusted them. I'd kind of been in a situation that I had been in a lot of times. I wasn't really self-aware at that time. I was a minor, so obviously I didn't have the antennas up how you normally do when you're after the fact, when you go through assaults, right? So the assault was very, very violent. I was, beat up basically, and also sexually assaulted and very aggressively. And this person was in the military. So I had a lot of fear of like going to the police. I remember riding my bike to the health department and being questioned, what was I wearing? What did I do to provoke the attack? So as a 17-year-old, that was really traumatic for me. And I went, I just kind of moved on with my life. That specific incident though, I went to school that day and I was bruised, and it definitely changed my perspective in life. I no longer lived in a bubble. My parents were Jehovah's Witnesses. They were, religious, and they're Hispanic. And I definitely, my life kind of shifted after that point. I kind of became unruly. I left my house, and then I suffered a second attack when I was working at a club. Somebody I worked with, and there is a difference between I feel for me, in my case, that I was drugged. I don't really remember the assault. I just remember the aftermath. But I think that the person stating that they had assaulted me and that I just laid there, and hearing that back is how I found out that I had been assaulted. And I was 19 years old at that time. And I remember I didn't file a police report. I'd been through this before. I didn't know really what to do. I didn't think anybody was going to believe me. I don't even know how I got into this situation. So again, I buried that situation and moved forward, right? When I was 21, I got assaulted again. I went to a party and I was actually with one of my first boyfriend, my ex-boyfriend at that time. And he saw me get taken out of the house with this guy. And I had only had like 2 drinks. Again, I was at a party setting. I was like, and sometimes we blame ourselves when that is our situation, because we're like, oh, I shouldn't have been there. What if? And that's just not relevant at the end of the day. Once you heal and stuff, you realize that situations happen. You can't control everything around you, right? So that situation, I woke up in a strange house, in a strange property. Again, I was either drugged or something happened, but I did not know that I knew that something had happened, but I didn't actually know what. So I'm like, oh my God, this is happening again. I'm 21. I'm like, this is insane. So we're at time number 3. And I was like, well, I'll just get dressed and run out. Right. So I ran out of the house, and it was a really big, nice house. And I just didn't even know where I was. So I'm just driving around. This is before, I think we used MapQuest, printing MapQuest perhaps back in the day. There was no, GPS or anything. So I could finally like oriented myself. I felt really sick. I felt like, something was given to me. I didn't feel physically well. Well, I'm at work. I'm working at fast forward 3 months. I'm working at my job. I was working in an office. I'm the front desk and the receptionist, and I fainted. I passed out, and I went to the doctor, and I was pregnant, but I hadn't had sex in my mind forever. It had been at least over 6 months because I had struggled with that part. So I hadn't been with anybody. So I'm like, how is this possible? I know I'm not the Virgin Mary here. Okay. So this situation, something's weird. And it turns out that the person who assaulted me had actually impregnated me. So I had to have an abortion because I couldn't keep the child. I was so angry with everything that I had. Everything had happened, and abortion is a taboo in every society and every culture and everything. And I had to make that decision so quickly. I didn't give myself time to process nothing. I just moved forward. And after that point, I really went down the working 16 hours a day, not sleeping, just excessively compulsion, like a lot of compulsion on everything that I did was at 100 miles an hour. My life became 100 miles an hour because I was always trying to run away from the multiple assaults that I had encountered in such a short period of time and such crucial years of my life. So it did a lot of damage, but I'm so thankful that, I found a place to help me get my life back on track. I'm happily married now. So that's a wonderful thing. And I've been in a solid, healthy relationship for the past 5 years. And I have a good relationship with my parents now. So I'm beyond thankful and grateful for the opportunity that I had to be able to turn everything around.
And I think what Karla touches on as far as coming forward and whether or not you feel comfortable doing so and whether or not you press charges, et cetera, has to do with your circumstances and maturity at that time. And Karla was so young. My first assault was I was in my early 20s, and this was the brother of my best friend. He was a police officer. I thought I would be safe, and it was a date rape situation. And when I, stumbled into my clothes and got home and was just, shaking and crying, and I told his sister, and she didn't believe me. And then when I tried to talk to him, he told me that I imagined it and it never happened. And he completely convinced me that I was crazy, that I had imagined the whole thing. And I'm a registered nurse. This was one of my first jobs as a nurse, fresh out of college. And I was not doing well at work. And one of the doctors, a female physician, pulled me aside and said, basically, what's wrong with you? Why aren't you functioning today? And I just broke down and told her what happened. And she grabbed me by the shoulders and tilted my head up and looked me in the eye and said, Kelly, you are the least crazy person I know. So she believed me. And at that point, I didn't think the police would believe me because he was one of them. So I didn't report it to the police, but it made such a difference that someone I respected did believe me. And similar to Karla, it turned out I was pregnant and had to make similar decisions as what Karla did. So I think one of the reasons that Karla and I connected once we finally got to group therapy is because our stories, although very different and at different ages, had some similarities. And I think the other thing that happens is after an assault, you feel that other people and yourself feel a lot of shame. What could I have done differently? How did I get in this situation? Is this my fault? And then, like Karla, my family was very, very religious. They came from a fundamentalist Christian background, and so prayer and was supposed to heal everything. And because sex before marriage is taboo in that particular religious connotation or background, that I couldn't go to my parents and tell them what happened. So except for the sister, gentleman's sister, I didn't tell anyone else. And like Karla, threw myself into work, buried it, got very depressed, didn't think anyone would ever want me. And so by the time I reached was 30, I agreed to marry the first person that asked me, and turned out he was an alcoholic, and when he was drunk, he would black out. He wouldn't remember what happened, but he would hold me down and very brutally have sex with me, without my consent. And I had a baby, and there was a nanny in the house, so I would have to bite my tongue and try not to cry out because I didn't want to wake the baby, and I didn't want the nanny to know what was going on. And it got to where I would hide from him. I would crawl under the bed and hide under there, and he'd find me, and I'd go under my daughter's bed, and he would find me there and drag me out. And so finally we had a 2-story house. I began locking myself in the downstairs bathroom and hiding behind the shower curtain, just praying that he wouldn't find me that night, and he would wander the house yelling for me. And it just kind of went on, and he didn't believe me when I tried to confront him about what he was doing. And so one night, instead of hiding, by that time the cell phones had come out, and so I put it on record, and I didn't hide. I just let it happen, and I recorded it, and I confronted him with it the next day. And that was the only way that I was able to get him to believe me. And then not long after that, he asked for a divorce, said he didn't love me anymore, and he wanted out of the marriage. So not only had I endured all those years of abuse, but when I finally confronted him and he knew the truth, then I was rejected again. So that was a very, very difficult time. And then while I was going through the divorce, which took about 2.5 years, I was having dinner with my daughter at a restaurant near where I was living during the separation. And after I walked her to her car, I was parked on the street, and the street lights were out. And I had gotten in my car, and you know how you text or check your emails when you first get in the car, and something hit the back of my car, and I thought, what the heck? So I got out of the car, and I tell women now, no matter what happens, if you see a flyer on your windshield, if somebody hits you from behind, no matter where you are, do not get out of that car. Just call the police. But I didn't know that. So I got out of the car, and as I turned to shut the car door to walk to the back of my car to see what happened, a very large hand grabbed my arm hard, and something sharp was pressed against my neck, and a voice said, "You will come with us or we take your daughter." So someone had been watching me and had followed me to my car. And then I was injected with something, and I woke up hours later in my car in a bad area of town with my underwear missing and my jeans off and on the floorboard of the car. And I felt weird, like Karla was saying with her. I knew something happened. I was sore. I didn't understand. I was having trouble sitting. I couldn't figure out why my pants were on the floor. I was very confused. I called the person I was dating at that time to come and get me. Of course, while I'm waiting, I put my pants back on, and he looked at me and said he thought I was drunk. So he moved my car thinking he was going to protect me from a DUI, but I wasn't drunk. I had been drugged. And when the police came, they took me to the emergency room. And at first they thought I was psychotic, that I was having a psychological problem because I couldn't stop shaking, and I was rocking back and forth because in my mind I was trying to process what had happened, and I couldn't understand. And then I didn't want anybody to know, like Karla said. Well, my boyfriend at the time called my parents, and they drive 2.5 hours down. Now I felt like everybody knows. And the police just kept asking me, they kept saying, "You don't have a mark on you," and then they told my boyfriend, "Well, we've seen this in cases of infidelity. She probably just had an affair and doesn't want to tell you." And my dad was begging them, can you just collect the evidence and store it? And when she's able to process this better, then she can press charges then. And they said, no, you have to sign this paper that you're going to press charges or you can't have a medical exam. And later I found out when I got my medical records, they had written in the medical records that I refused the sexual assault team, which is not what happened. I was denied the sexual assault exam and team to come in and help me. And I could hear the cops saying to my parents, well, we've seen this in cases of infidelity. And they put all these doubts. And sure enough, within 3 months, that relationship ended because my boyfriend, didn't believe what had happened to me. And the other thing that was when I was telling my story, it kept coming out all mixed up. And what I learned from therapy is that in trauma, your memories don't form in a linear fashion, from beginning to end in a logical fashion, because trauma is so disruptive to your mental and emotional state. Your memories jump around, and that's what was happening. And that's another reason why the cops didn't believe me, because I'd say one thing and then I'd change. No, I think it was like this. Well, I couldn't really remember. So my memory, my mind was trying to fill in those blanks because I didn't know exactly what happened. And then all the bruising showed up. I don't bruise. My bruising is delayed. So I didn't, I found bruising on my thighs and needle marks on my arm. All that showed up the following day. There was a clear handprint bruising on my arm the next day. But the bruising on my buttocks, but none of that showed up in the ER within an hour of being brought there. So of course I wasn't believed. And it wasn't until, and then the next day I tried to go to my primary care physician and said, can you test me for diseases? I don't know, if I have anything. And that's, and he was going to send me, he didn't know what to do. So he was going to send me back to the ER, so that even in the medical community and primary care, a lot of these medical professionals don't know how to handle assault cases or how to help victims or survivors, which was what happened there. So I ended up, like I said earlier, 36 hours later, finally a kidnapping detective called, and I just lost it on the phone and was, was crying and sobbing and yelling, can you please just, give me a phone number or let me talk to somebody. I need some tests done. And that's finally when I got the phone number. So I think that what Karla and I had in common is repeated assaults, not being believed, feeling a lot of shame, not having the resources or support at that time, and being pushed in directions that we weren't ready for at that time.
I want to thank you both so much for sharing your stories today. And I'm so sorry about how, what happened and also how people reacted to it. You both touch on a lot of different things. Of course, victim blaming. We talk a lot about that on the podcast, and how I just want to reiterate, and I can never reiterate this enough, it's never the victim's fault. It's always the blame should always be put back on the perpetrator. And there's a lot of different things that tell victims like, oh, what were you wearing, and all these things, and they're just not important. And that's not what sexual violence is about. It's all about power and control, and it's one person exerting their power over someone else. And then the other thing that you both touched on was, the fear of not being believed. And essentially, I just wanted to kind of talk a little bit about, when we were planning this podcast, how it can take some time for survivors to come forward and share their stories. So we touched on, the fear of not being believed, victim blaming. I also want to uplift you talking about the effects of trauma and how that can also, like you mentioned, make things difficult about remembering what happened, because your brain is just trying to protect you from that. And it makes sense that it's difficult to remember. I don't know if there were any other things that you wanted to touch on as far as barriers to coming forward or reasons why survivors may not share their story right away.
So I think that some of the factors that inhibit people from coming forward are different, depending on the person. At least in my case, and in Kelly's case, religion was one. Mine was cultural background. It made it really difficult to openly speak about things like this. it took me till I was about 22 years old to come forward to my parents about the first assault. And in Central America, my parents are highly religious. Their cultural background is Central American, so it's a very strict type of culture, and I wasn't comfortable talking about that with them. So I had a lot of shame, I had a lot of guilt, and I think that kind of holds you back from being able to come forward. Also, in some cultures, discipline almost borderlines abuse, and it doesn't allow you to build the building blocks for you to have at the very beginning of life to really be able to distinguish danger properly. So in a sort of a way, I was a little bit set up for failure, just by having to deal with, in-home violence and kind of having a broken spirit from the very beginning. Taboos too, I think, serve as an obstacle for allowing people to move forward and talk about it. In my culture, drinking is a taboo. Women who drink are looked down upon. So I was drinking a lot at that time during my second and my third assault. So I, not only the shame of it happening again, but then the shame of, hey, I was drunk, I could not tell my parents that. So that took me a very, very long time to be able to even speak on those two. It took me about 7 years. I was almost 30 years old when I decided to come and seek help. And this was many years after having severe stress-related illnesses. I had insomnia, like a workaholic lifestyle, where I just worked a lot, slept very little. I was dealing with substance abuse issues and severe stress-related illnesses like PTSD. Kelly also had PTSD. It's something that we dealt with when we were going through our process. I think that, like, as humans, we just have a way of trying to bury the past, right? And it comes up in trauma. We'll just try to forget about it by acting in ways that we can cover up the trauma. After my assaults, I mentioned that I did work a lot. I was very successful in what I was doing. I was a car model and I was a host, and I was able to get a radiology tech degree. Thank God that I was able to get myself through education, but the cost of that, bearing that stuff not coming forward was really high. I barely slept. I never wanted to be alone. I was constantly surrounded by people and acting out with high risk behavior, so just going out to the clubs by myself, going to parties by myself at all hours of the night. I just wasn't very careful with how I was acting because I was not taking the time to heal, so over time, lifestyle choices that you make, can prolong you seeking help. So I think that's another thing that people don't realize, that the way that they act or things that they're doing is actually inhibiting them from coming forward. So it really becomes a problem over time, mentally and physically. Some people turn to drugs and alcohol or different types of compulsions. So, my parents, like I mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, gave me the option to be able to seek help with a rehab or to seek therapy. And I chose therapy. And that's when, I finally decided to confront my past and take care of me for a change. So.
Thank you so much, Karla. I really appreciate you being so candid and open and vulnerable with us and sharing your real life experience. I think that this will be really helpful for survivors to hear so that they know that they're not alone, which I think we'll be revisiting that a lot on this podcast. But you touch on so many important things. For example, I didn't think of this second component of you drinking and that being taboo in your culture, in your family culture. It makes me think of, for example, why survivors in the LGBTQ plus community might not come forward, or like if they're part of a domestic violence situation and no one even knew that they were in this particular relationship, or for example, underage drinking. If there is someone who's underage drinking, they're too afraid to share that piece of the story. And so that's why they harbor it. And then you saying that took you 7 years is actually the average time it takes a survivor to reach out. So that's important to highlight too. And I really appreciate you kind of going and breaking down the effects of harboring that, because it really can be, as you mentioned, very detrimental in that sense.
Yeah, it's very destructive for sure.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think, what would I say to someone that had been a victim and wasn't quite ready or to come forward or to get help, I think I would just tell them, know your resources so that when you are ready, you can get the help that you need. For example, if your whatever community you live in, there should be some type of a crime advocate or victim service center. Find out what that hotline or phone number is, tape it to your steering wheel, tape it to your wallet, tape it to your bathroom mirror, so that when the moment hits you that you're like, I can't take it anymore, I need to talk to someone, I need to get some help, you have that number ready and available. The other thing I would recommend, if you're a victim and haven't, a survivor and haven't come forward to get support for yourself, is to journal what you're going through, your thoughts, your feelings, whatever they are, and accept your feelings, whatever they are, they're okay. Write them down. And what that's going to do for you is it's going to give you a place to start when you eventually seek help and are in therapy. You can kind of bring those thoughts and journaling with you, because a lot of times you get so overwhelmed in therapy, you don't know what to say to your therapist or counselor, and you don't know where to start. And of course, they're going to guide you, but if you can kind of have that journal in front of you and go, well, these are the things that have been going through my mind over and over and over. And I think it's sort of like a broken tape recorder thing that happens. Karla talks about not sleeping. Well, when you go to sleep, what happens? Your subconscious comes through, and you start reliving those horrible moments. And in both our cases, if you don't have a complete memory of that event, your subconscious starts filling that in, and then you start accepting what may or may not have been the reality of the situation. And so that leads to nightmares and flashbacks, and being afraid to walk from the door of the shoe store to your car in the parking lot at night. I mean, there's all sorts of ramifications of that. And so having, once you've experienced an assault, knowing what your resources are, whether or not you're ready to use them is beside the point, but knowing what those resources are and having that number of resource available so that when you are ready, you can go ahead and pursue that. And also knowing that most people don't come forward with help and seek help right away. One of the things Karla and I learned is that the average time from an assault to seeking help is sometimes 7 years or longer. For child abuse victims, sometimes they're adults before they seek help for what happened to them as children. And so they're living their whole lives with this sort of trauma hanging over them. And so don't beat yourself up if you've had an assault or a trauma of any kind and you haven't come forward yet. It's okay. When you're ready, you'll seek that help, but just know what your resources are.
Yeah, I love everything that you both are saying and that you're touching on. As I love the idea of the journaling too, because you're right. I think, therapy can be overwhelming when you don't even know where to start. So it's nice to kind of use that as an outlet at the moment. I also want to touch on that like, you're both talking about the effects that trauma can have on someone, like the insomnia, for example, the flashbacks. And I just want to highlight that these are very normal responses to trauma. I think a lot of times survivors may worry that they're not responding, quote unquote, correctly to trauma. And I just want to say, however you're responding is that's normal to how, the human body processes and responds to trauma. That being said, Karla, I don't know if you had anything that you wanted to touch on as far as what you would say to a survivor who may not feel ready.
For me, the biggest piece of advice is that I would tell them to be kind and to be patient to themselves. I don't think people hear that enough. There's no set time. There's no time span. There's not an action that's going to happen for you to come forward. I think the piece of advice that I could offer is if you're experiencing or starting to experience like substance abuse or other type of high risk behaviors, I think it's at least that's kind of your sign to start thinking about, having an outlet. Picking a person, a coworker, maybe a friend, maybe a person you can trust to at least tell your story to. Let's say you're not ready for therapy, but at least to have some sort of outlet to be able to get that out, because the more we internalize, the more self-destructive we can become.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I also wanted to touch on, some myths. and common misconceptions. I tend to do that a lot in my podcast. So that being said, what are some common myths that you would like to debunk as it pertains to a survivor's healing journey? I know we went through a lot of them when we were planning this podcast, but what are some examples that you'd like to debunk?
One of the things that I learned is that healing is not linear. You don't start at a 0 level of functioning and 6 weeks later you're at a level 10 level of functioning. It doesn't work that way. It's more like a roller coaster. You make some progress and then you have a downward spiral, and then you make some progress and you back up a little bit. And because as you deal with what happened to you, you can uncover other issues in your life that impact that healing. And you're not, the assault doesn't happen in isolation. You're a human being with many different facets, and all of those things, your culture, your religious or spiritual background, your where you live, whether it's rural or urban, what kind of educational background you have, all of that comes into play in how you cope and recover. And so healing isn't linear, and there is no time limit. It's similar in some ways to grieving the loss of a loved one. I lost my baby sister, and it took me a year before I could talk about her loss without breaking down and crying. And I remember my husband at the time said, you need to take down her pictures, you need to put this away, and you need to move on. And the counselor said, no, some people grieve for 6 weeks, some people grieve for 6 months, some people grieve the rest of their lives. And it's the same with a trauma. Maybe some people do heal in 6 weeks or 6 months, and others, continue to heal for the rest of their life. And I think that's what Karla and I are experiencing. So trying to put the myth that you should be better in a straight shot within a certain length of time is not true. That's a myth, and healing is very individual. And what works for one person will not work for another. And so you have to work with your groups and your individual therapists to find what works for you, what type of therapy will work for you, and to not have unrealistic expectations for your recovery. I think one of the things that was very beneficial to me is they have this thing called maybe I'm not saying it right, but trauma recovery scale. And it's just a one-page series of questions that sort of ask, how you're feeling on a scale of 1 to 10 on, say, for example, intrusive thoughts or flashbacks or feeling safe or not feeling safe. And so you can kind of get a general idea of where you are, and over time see progress. And again, it's not going to be in a straight line, but at least you have sort of a baseline, and it can only go up. You're kind of at the bottom when you come in. So that, and then the other thing is, one of the things that Karla and I really struggled with is that we very much felt like we were damaged goods, that no one would ever want us again because we had been sullied. And that is so not true. We're both beautiful women, and it doesn't matter what we look like on the outside or what's happened to us on the inside. We are survivors, and we're strong, and we made it this far, and we are worth it. We're so worthwhile. And you just have to understand that if no one can allow you to feel less unless you allow it yourself. So don't allow anyone to judge you. Don't accept that. Understand that you are essential. You are enough. And just don't buy into that myth that you're sullied goods or damaged goods, because you're not.
And I'm going to bounce off that, Kelly. It's one thing that we really, when we were in group together, we did group together, and that's one thing I struggled with, right? And I see how it affects Kelly, and I'm trying to hold myself together, because that's the misconception that if you've been assaulted more than once, or even once, some people they're very judgmental on that, or that you're damaged goods, that no one's going to marry you, no one's going to date you, no one's going to be around you, you're not going to have successful relationships, and that it's just not true. right? There will be struggles. There'll be mental health struggles with it. That's another thing that people don't realize. Like, it's something that consumes you, right? And if you develop anxiety or you develop, PTSD. I had severe PTSD. Kelly's had PTSD. It's something that we had to work through, and that misconception that you can just talk about it, it'll be over, or that now you have PTSD or depression or anxiety, and now you're damaged goods. It's all in correlation, right? So as you are able to work through your traumas and you're able to process them, those the anxiety, the PTSD, the depression kind of tend to go away as well. So you might be experiencing something that you were never before. Maybe you were a happy person and you were bubbly and friendly and everything, and now you're always depressed and you're super anxious, and now you have flashbacks and you have nightmares, you can't sleep. That's not for you forever, right? People get stuck in that situation where I'm not worth anymore because I'm damaged now, and now I have problems, and and this is how I'm going to be. That is just part of the body, not being able to process what has happened, right? And your psyche it's fragile at that time, but it is something that can be overcome. Me and Kelly come from very strict religious backgrounds. Religion, when you're raised in a religious home, there are certain standards and that they expect you to live up, expectations that they expect you to live up. And if you don't, that's okay. You know what I mean? Not everybody is made to be in the same mold, whether you're Hispanic, Black, Asian, white, it doesn't matter, right? We all have, in some way, there's some cultural ties that we all share. But we're not meant as human beings to be in a mold and be, we should not, and first of all, we shouldn't be living in anybody else's rule book, right? We should be our own person. But I think that that misconception of being damaged and not being worth it is just something that you need to fight through and understand that, you might have some hurdles to overcome, but once you're able to get the correct help and dedicate yourself to, your healing, that can go away. So another one of myths, that at least I experienced, I'm very open about my substance abuse and my alcoholism that I experienced for many, many years. It's a high risk behavior, but it doesn't necessarily mean that because you were drinking or because, whatever situation you're in, that was your fault, right? It's if you decided to go out, if you decided to go to a party, if you decided to wear a short skirt, a lot of makeup, nothing that you did caused that. The aggressors, the predator is going to be out there at that time. It just happens to be that time, right? So, a lot of things too that people think about is that sexually assaults there's two of them, either by 100% by people and then people you don't know. In my case, it was people I knew. One was somewhat, but Kelly had a complete stranger. So it's not to sit here and label people, because that kind of goes into paranoia. But the biggest thing, I think, that the myth is that it's your fault, and it is not your fault. And that is one of the things that I think is hardest to overcome, but it can be overcome, that you just cannot blame yourself. Nothing that you did put you in this position for this to happen to you.
The other thing I wanted to touch on very briefly is that there's this misconception that it's the way you dress, or because you're pretty, or because you're young, that you're sought after as a victim. And that's not true. I mean, my assault by the stranger happened shortly after my 50th birthday. And so it does this as sexual assault and other sorts of trauma don't just happen to the young and the beautiful. It can happen to anyone, male or female, child or adult. And I think that's another myth that that we need to acknowledge, is that there is no stereotype of a victim or a survivor. It can be of any, like Karla said, any race, gender, background, age. And that's important as well, to know that. And, Karla and I talk about our religious backgrounds. I mean, some people find that religion and spirituality actually helps them with their healing process. Their faith is something that brings them through. And if that's the case for you, that's incredibly valuable that you have that higher power to look to, your God, your Christ, to look to pull you through. But if you come from that type of background and you're finding that your faith is not helping you through, which was my case, I felt that God had rejected me, even though I knew in my head that was not true, that God stays the same. But I felt rejected. And so faith for me was not, prayer and faith were not tools that initially helped me get through. So having, the myth that, if you just have enough faith, or if you just pray hard enough, things will all get better and you'll be healed. That may be true for you, but it may not. And having an unrealistic expectation that I'm not saying that it can't, but if it's not working for you, you shouldn't have that guilt compounded, your feelings of guilt compounded because your religion or your faith or your spirituality is not working for you in that moment. So I think that's another myth.
Yeah, I appreciate you both kind of sharing and breaking down these myths and misconceptions. I think it's really important because we can see how damaging it can be, these myths and misconceptions to survivors of trauma. You were kind of touching on the idea that, and I hope that that's what this whole podcast really is about, which is the individuality of healing, that some things work for some people and some things don't, and that's okay. Because I think that, like your example, Kelly, of, if this isn't working for me, then feelings of hopelessness can definitely come from that, I think. And so it's a really good message to share that there's multiple ways to go about healing, and they're all important for the survivor to know what works for them and that they're not alone. And I love that you and Karla have connected and are able to support each other. And that's absolutely wonderful, which, we were talking a little bit about, what worked and what didn't work in your healing journey. So I wanted to see if you would be able to either share about what didn't work. And we kind of touched a little bit about that. Kelly, you talked about your faith-based healing, and then maybe family members or an unsupportive family or something like that. So if you wanted to touch more on what didn't work in your healing journey, I invite you to do that. And also what did work specifically for you in your healing journeys.
One thing I wanted to touch on is Karla keep talking about people being unsupportive. So someone might be listening out there saying, well, my best friend just went through a trauma. How can I help her? How can I help him? And I just kind of had three thoughts as I was preparing for this podcast of what I wish someone had said to me. And so I just wanted to share those, and feel free to copy and rephrase so that you can support your friends or relatives that might be going through a trauma. Okay, so the first of all, what not to do. So don't ask the following questions. Well, did the police catch him? That's not helpful. Did you fight back? That is not only irrelevant, it is very not helpful. One thing that irritated me, well, did you know him when it happened? Why didn't you press charges? Don't ask those sorts of questions. Most of the time, to be honest with you, we can't answer those questions. If we don't remember whatever we did in that situation, in our situation, whether we fought back, whether we didn't fight back, whatever we did was right because we did what we had to do to survive. And I think that we survived is the key, not did the police catch them? Did we press charges? Did we fight? What's important is we survived. And that's what would be helpful for you all to focus on. What you should say is something like this. I don't know the right words to say to make things better for you, Kelly, but please know I care and I'm willing to listen when you're ready to share. Or, Kelly, I cannot imagine what you must be going through, but I want you to know I'm here for you however you need me to be. Or, Kelly, I believe you and I love you no matter what. Or, Kelly, however you are feeling right now, it's okay. Please tell me how I can help. And I think though that's what I wish people would have said to me when these things had happened.
I love those, examples Kelly. I think that's really, really helpful. I think a lot of times supporters don't know what to say. And so I love that you shared what would have been helpful. I think that whoever's listening, I hope that that's helpful to you in your life. And you can take that with you. And yeah, thank you so much for sharing, Kelly.
Yeah.
I wanted to also ask, what else works specifically? Maybe I think we've talked a little bit about in the past groups or specific therapies, if you'd like to touch on those, or any kind of risk reduction techniques, anything that you'd like to share that helped you specifically on your healing journeys.
I'm going to share really quick because I know Kelly did a little bit more than me, so I'll let her go after me. She did a lot of groups, but where me and Kelly met was one of the groups, and I'm just gonna jump back on the misconception. One misconception is that nobody's ever been through something like me. You think that you're in the abyss all alone. So when you are in therapy, they do give you at least at VSC, right? They give you the option to do group. Very scary. That's okay to be scared. Oh my God, how am I going to meet other people? You want to hide under a rock. You're nervous. I wanted to throw up the first day that I showed up at this group. When I was walking in the door, I wanted to throw up. That's okay. You can feel it's scary, right? To confront your past. It's scary to meet other people and have to share these experiences. Ew, that's crazy, right? But once you get in there and you realize that, oh my God, am I sitting in the room with other people that have been through stuff like this? And that kind of takes that feeling of being afraid away as you go through the group, right? And it's a bonding experience because you realize that there is other people out there that have been living with this situation that's could be very similar to yours, could be very different to yours. But again, at the end of the day, you've all been through some trauma, right? Group was excellent. It helped me feel like like I said, I became friends with Kelly. It helped me feel not alone. It destroyed that part of my life where I felt so isolated from everybody around me because I was, going through this by myself. I had to live with this and I couldn't really talk about it. I didn't know how. And with group, when I did group, it helped me not only connect with someone that I, like with Kelly, that I share so many common themes, whether it's and healthy themes and family background experiences. We both work in the medical field. Like there are so many things that we end up connecting, but it's not necessarily like, let's say you're going to be your best friend, but at least you get to feel that you are in part of a community, right? Or part of a group of people, not a club that we all want to be in, right? But we're in this club now, we're members, right? And we get to at least have that experience where we can let loose a little bit and accept, what we've been through. We cried together, we laughed together, and then it became a weekly thing where we got excited to see each other, and it was such a great experience for me to have done group. And I think that it's very important to take that next step. It's a little risky. It'll feel awkward. It'll feel uncomfortable, but I think it's worth it. I think if you have the opportunity to take on a group or two or three or whatever, your skill set is at, or things that you need to learn. But I think it's important to take that time for yourself to learn, the experience of other people and maybe, heal even more, but as a group. And I think that is just so beautiful. And it was just one of the most important times in my life.
Yeah, I agree. By the time I got to the Victim Service Center, I was so desperate to get better. I couldn't take the way I was feeling, the way my life was going and spiraling at that time. And I was willing to try anything to get better. And the first thing I started was just individual therapy. And at that time, there were a lot of social work and counseling interns. And so it seemed like every month I had a different therapist. And while all of them were very, very good, it wasn't until I had one consistent person to work with that was assigned to my case that I really felt like I started to make progress. And at that point, the person that was counseling me recommended that I develop some skills. And so I was put into basically a skill group called DBT. It stands for Dialectical Behavioral Training. And basically it reframes your thinking and teaches you behavioral skills to cope with whatever PTSD symptoms you're having, whether that's flashbacks, anxiety, nightmares, insomnia, hypersexuality, and whatever your situation is, it teaches you ways of reframing your thinking and becoming aware of how your thinking is actually damaging, and you need to change that. And it gives you those skills. So I did a skill-based group that was, I think, 6 or 8 weeks long. And then after I had those skills and had time to practice them, then I was put in the group where I met Karla. And that was a group that was more, instead of an intellectual, cognitive, behavioral type processing of the trauma, this was an emotional processing. So once we had the intellectual, cognitive, and behavioral skills, once I had those, I mean, I wasn't an expert, but once I had some of those tools in my tool chest, my recovery tool chest, then I was finally ready to join an emotional processing group. And there were 4 of us. And at this point, it depends on what kind of trauma you've been to as to what group you would join. So if you were a victim of, say, childhood sexual abuse, then you would want to be with survivors of that particular trauma. What if you were a victim of being, beat to a bloody pulp without sexual assault, you would want to be with survivors of being physically assaulted without sexual assault. What Karla and I, the group we were in, were 4 of us that were all different ages and backgrounds. But one thing we had in common is we were all rape survivors. And then here I am, the old lady, I felt like in my 50s, I felt like the mother to the group. But we were all there. And one of the hardest things, like Karla said, first thing she walks in, I'm like, oh my God, how could anything happen to her? She's so beautiful. She had the hair and the boots and the whole thing going on. And we all had our all different personalities, but we could, it was instant. You could see we were all kind of walking on eggshells. And they give you a schedule so you know kind of what's going to be talked about at each session. I remember it was either session 2 or 3, we had to share our stories. And I was petrified. I thought, how am I going to get through this 3rd night? But what was really amazing was after that meeting where we all had to tell our stories, what was really neat to look around, when I was telling my story, I couldn't even look at any of them in the eye. But when I finally raised my eyes at the end of sharing what had happened to me, all I saw was empathy and tears in the other 3 women's eyes for me. And when each of them told their story, I felt myself being pulled, wanting to put my hand on Karla's shoulder, give her a hug. I mean, whoever it was that was telling their story, we all accepted, we all believed. And after that night, group was completely different. The barriers were gone. We were all on we had all bared our souls, and the healing, I felt like, finally started to happen. But one of the things that was a requirement when you're in that kind of an emotional processing group is you also have to be in individual therapy, because in group, things are going to come up that you didn't realize you needed to process. Someone else in the group will bring something up, and you're like, oh my God, that's me too. So being in individual therapy would help. And what I found in my individual therapy is that just talking about it was not helping me. So my therapist did something called EMDR, which stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. But it's just basically a technique where you either follow a light, or in my case, visual things didn't work for me. So I held like buzzers and closed my eyes, and the therapist controls the rate and frequency of either the light or the buzzing, and helps you process one thought at a time, and gradually brings you through the trauma. And it takes a long time. It's not, a couple of weeks and you're better. In my case, it took a couple of years, but you can definitely see progress. So I think EMDR therapy, the cognitive behavioral processing, teaching me skills, giving me tools in my toolbox. And then finally, after having those things, being put in a group with survivors of a similar trauma, those things were what helped. I did do some other things, some art therapy groups, which wasn't very helpful to me, except I did like someone gave us like a smooth rock and we could write something on it and just hold it when we were anxious. We did things like learning to put like lavender squirted on a Kleenex. And if you get anxious, kind of sniff that and go to your happy place. That scent would, tactile things, touch, feel, smell, taking you to a happy place and being able to do that. That was somewhat helpful. I did do a spirituality and recovery that wasn't very helpful for me, but other people in the group got a lot out of that. So the important thing is that to know what those resources are and try things until you find something that does work. And it may be, like for me, a combination of therapies.
Yeah, thank you so much for both of you for sharing your experiences with these different tools. It's funny that you bring up DBT because we're actually going to do a whole podcast on that soon. So if anyone's interested in that, we're going to be talking about that soon. But I appreciate, what you both are kind of saying is like taking this risk of trying different things and to see if that they work for you. And it's okay if they don't, and it's awesome if they do. You might be able to get something out of it at least. And also this idea that it could be multiple facets too, and things working together. There's not like a one catch-all be-all kind of thing. So not only is it individual for everyone, but also this idea of kind of using a lot of different resources at the same time. So thank you both so much. I wanted to also ask, what is something you wished you knew before you began your surviving or healing journeys?
For me, I really struggled with the sheltering that I had growing up. I grew up in a very strict household. I wish that, we were taught some building blocks for life. Maybe it would have helped me be a little less naive, and maybe more self-aware. When you're a victim of sexual assault, you become paranoid after the assaults. So there has to be a balance of self-awareness and paranoia, right? As we have children, whether you're a male and you have a child, or you're a female and you have a child, and you get into a relationship, we need to teach our children that self-awareness, that there is dangers in the world, right? So instead of sheltering our children, I think it's crucial to teach teens and young adults safety protocols so that they, at least have a little bit more self-awareness. Society as a whole doesn't give you a to-do list on what dangers are portrayed or what actions have this consequence. It's not really taught, especially with a society that pushes sexuality at a level that it's making it mainstream. It's everywhere. It's in our faces day and night. I think that the dangers of certain types of behaviors are not taught with the consequence. So that way that people don't have that self-awareness that is crucial, especially in the teen years.
And I think just being taught some basic self-awareness skills. For example, if you're shopping at night and you're by yourself, being aware of your surroundings. Don't just leave the store and walk directly to your car. Scan the parking lot, identify where your car is, look, park under a street light in the parking lot. May have your keys out and ready if you don't have an automatic door opener. If you're really nervous, have not paranoid, but just being, have 911 dial on your phone, but don't press the button. But if you need to, you've got that done. If you're going to go out clubbing, like for example, I love to dance, but I would never go into a bar or club by myself. I was with always have a buddy with me, a female or male buddy, a friend, and we look out for each other. We agree ahead of time. You will not allow me to go home with anybody but you. We agree to watch out for each other. And one example where that came in handy is I was with a girlfriend at a nursing conference, supposedly a safe place, and she was a very attractive young woman, and we were having a glass of wine, and she got up to go to the bathroom, and we didn't realize that these two young men behind us were kind of eyeing her, and she got up to go to the bathroom. When she came back, about 15 minutes after she came back to the bathroom, she started acting really weird, very not her, very sexually promiscuous, flirting outrageously. I'm like, what is going on with you? She just wasn't acting right. And then when we went to go to our hotel room, because we were sharing a room together, I noticed that these two men were following us. So I went up to one of the pharmaceutical reps and I said, I am uncomfortable. These two guys keep following us. Would you please escort us to our room? And this was someone I trusted. So this individual did. And the guys that were following us got off on the elevator at our floor. But because we had someone with us, they kept walking. I could tell they were taking a note of our door. And when we got into the room, my girlfriend starts stripping in front of this guy. She was a married woman, would have been completely mortified. The next day I go, you were really crazy last night. She didn't remember a thing. She had been roofied. Someone had slipped something into her wine. So because though we were on the buddy system and we were looking out for each other, I was able to help her. And then she taught me later when we were in New Orleans at another conference, she says, Kelly, what did we learn? And our thing was beer in a bottle that you open yourself, never, you don't allow yourself to be in a situation where someone could slip something into your drink. Never leave your drink unattended. Just be aware of your surroundings, have a buddy system. So these were things we learned by trial and error that I wish had been, because they're not intuitive. I'm kind of oblivious. I didn't grow up in New York City, so I'm not as aware, and I wish someone had taught me these things earlier.
Yeah, and you're touched on a lot of different things, both of you, and I do an active bystander training, and it is right what you said, where you can have a buddy system and also checking in with each other. Mm-hmm. This is not how she would normally act, or she just had one glass of wine, what's going on? And these are essentially like risk reduction. And when I do those trainings, I always let people know, whatever happens, whether you do all these things or none of these things, it's not your fault. However, these are just some things that can help some people feel more safe. So thank you for sharing those. What advice, and you already gave some wonderful advice, Kelly, but what advice would you give to supporters of loved ones that have gone through trauma? So we talked about, some things they should avoid or what they can do to help. So I don't know if there's anything you wanted to piggyback off of, Karla.
So judgment, I think, is a big one, right? Something I had thought about and I didn't bring up this time, but sexual behavior, hyper sexual behavior, right? Someone might go through an assault and just be weirded out by sex and just not want to date and not want to be, and don't call them a prude, don't judge them based on that, because that's the way they're dealing with. Or someone goes through a sexual assault and becomes hypersexual and just has multiple partners. Don't judge them. Understand that this is part of the process, that judgment, a piece, whether you agree with it or not, it's not your place to really put rules and regulations on a person's behavior, because this is how a person is coping. If a person falls into, depression, anxiety, PTSD, has some mental health problems, it's best to be a support system than making them feel that there's something wrong with them, right? If a person that's been sexually assaulted it turns to substance abuse, right? Be a party. I'll tell you, my brother was excellent for me in that department. He was a little bit open-minded, was like, she's a little crazy, but, and when it started to get to a point where it was disrupting my day-to-day life, he intervened, but not in an aggressive way. He was like, hey, I really care about you. I'm really worried about you. I know you've been through a lot. What can I do to help you? Can I call my parents? Can we sit down with you? It was asking me questions on how can I help you, instead of you are and you do. And instead of having that you judgment type of personality, I had a decent support system. My brother's always been my support system, but he helped me take the steps to get to where I am. And considering, I grew up in a home with two bipolar people, he is as well. And I'd already learned the behaviors I researched a lot of what type, the personality types, right? So I did at least have those skill sets on kind of how to deal with it. But my brother considering all that, he was never judgmental. And I think if you're going to be the person that's going to try to be there for a loved one that has been through, I think that you need to take a very neutral stand on that. You can't impose what you believe and what you want for them, because at the end of the day, it might not be what they want or what they need at that time.
I think it's important to listen more and talk less. When you're the person trying to offer support, and just some of the phrasing that I mentioned earlier are things that would be helpful to say. And I'll just repeat those real quickly. I don't know the right words to say to make things better, but please know I care and I'm willing to listen when you're ready to share. Or I cannot imagine what you must be going through, but I want you to know that I'm here for you however you need me to be, which is what Karla was saying. I believe you and I love you no matter what. Just unconditional acceptance. And then however you're feeling right now, hey, it's okay. Tell me how I can help. If you're angry, if you're depressed, I have never been through that. I can't imagine, but I'm here to help. Tell me what you need.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you so much again for sharing those things and for repeating them too, Kelly. Those are really helpful. I love what you touched on, Karla, about like that power and giving that control back to the survivor. Because once again, we know that sexual violence is about power and control. And so the survivor having that power back is important and in charge of their own healing journey. As supporters, we shouldn't be driving the bus, is what I like to say. We should be having the survivor drive the bus and we're the passenger, and maybe we'll pull out a map and let them know where they want to go. And then also touching on, as a supporter, knowing the effects of trauma is really important, that sometimes survivors can react hypo or hyper sexually, talking about, we were talking about insomnia, for example. So just knowing these effects and how they can be one side or the other, and those are all normal responses to trauma, is really helpful too. So thank you so much. As a final question, before we sign off here, I just wanted to ask if there's anything you would like to share with possible survivors who may be listening to this podcast.
So I would like to tell them that you're not alone, that we do love you, because sometimes you just have to deal with your trauma alone, and knowing that someone out there cares about you, that loves you, is huge. It can be very overwhelming. It can be scary when you haven't confronted it. And this is why, as time goes on, it becomes more and more overwhelming. So it never get to the feeling where you're not worth it, because you are valuable. You're beautiful just the way you are, with your scars and your trauma. Because at the end of the day, my therapist, Brandy, told me once when I came into therapy that I came in basically with gaping wounds, right, that heal into scars. And the wounds are still present, but that just shows the strength, right? So that shows the strength that you have to overcome this. And a person with scars is strong. They've been through a lot. So if you survive this situation, it just shows how strong you truly are, and that you can heal. So you heal as long as you have the compassion to love yourself and seek help.
And I agree. The number one thing that I would like you that are listening to know is that, honey, no matter who you are, you're not alone. You're definitely not alone, and we believe you. We absolutely believe you. And the most important is that there is hope and healing is possible. So don't give up on yourself. You're gonna get through this. You may not get over it, but you will get through it, and you will find inner strength that you had no idea you had. And we just applaud you for having the courage to survive.
Wow, I think that's a wonderful place to sign off. So thank you so much. And thank you to the listener for listening to the Victim Service Center podcast. The VSC is a nonprofit organization that provides free confidential counseling services for victims of any kind of trauma in Central Florida. To learn more about our services, please visit victimservicecenter.org. And to everyone listening, healing is not linear and you are not alone. And thank you so, so much, Kelly and Karla, for joining me today. I really, really am honored to have you both on today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.